Every ritual has a stage. Every stage has a priest. You just never noticed who's been standing at the altar. What if the language of power was never invented for business? There is a specific quality in the way the most powerful founders of the last 30 years speak that almost no one examines directly. Not the content, the architecture, the pacing, the deliberate construction of who knows and who is allowed to find out. When Steve Jobs walked onto a stage, he did not present information. He presided over a disclosure. When Elon Musk describes the future of civilization, he is not forecasting. He is pronouncing. When Bezos described Amazon's mission, he was not pitching a company. He was declaring a cosmology. That distinction matters more than it seems. In the temples of ancient Mesopotamia, the priest did not explain divine will to the people. He interpreted it. He was the interface between what could not be seen and what the crowd needed to understand. His authority did not come from argument or evidence. It came from position, from repetition, from the carefully maintained impression that he had access to something no one else did, and that this access was not something that could be transferred or earned. Now watch a product launch. The darkened arena, the soundtrack building, the figure emerging from shadow, the object revealed as if it had crossed from somewhere else into the visible world. The voice, controlled and unhurried, that says, "This changes everything." The structure is not similar. It is identical. But here is what almost no one notices. The most memorable speeches from these figures are not built around facts. They are built around images that activate something older than rational thought. Bezos invoking day one as a permanent state of being, a philosophical stance that sounds like a spiritual discipline passed down through generations of practice. Musk framing humanity as a species with a mission to survive, using urgency that implies insider knowledge of a timeline no one else has access to. Jobs listing three separate things, repeating them slowly, then collapsing them into a single revelation, as if the audience had just witnessed a formal proof. Three claims, repeated, then unified, and the audience experiences that unification as their own conclusion, arrived at independently. This has a name in classical rhetoric. It has a name in medieval liturgy. It has a name in Renaissance ceremonial magic. In every one of those contexts, its function is the same: to produce in the listener the sensation that something fragmented has just become whole, that something previously invisible has just been made real, and that the person standing in front of them is the reason it happened. That sensation is not charisma. It is not personality. It is not the accidental byproduct of vision and intelligence. It is applied architecture, and it has a documented history that runs far deeper than the companies currently using it. How a three-part structure has moved crowds for 3,000 years. There is a three-part pattern embedded in every speech that has ever moved a mass audience from passive observation into active commitment. It does not matter whether that speech happened in a cathedral, a Silicon Valley keynote, or a political convention. The structure works the same way across all three contexts, because it is not targeting ideology. It is targeting something that sits underneath ideology entirely. The first component is the division of reality into two states. What exists now, framed as insufficient, broken, or dangerously incomplete, and what could exist, framed as not only possible but inevitable, if the right alignment occurs. This is not strategic vision in the business school sense. This is eschatology, the fallen world on one side, the restored world on the other, and the speaker positioned as the one who has seen both and knows the passage between them. The second component is the redistribution of agency. The audience is not asked to make independent decisions. They are invited to participate in something that exceeds individual decision-making. The word "we" does enormous work here. We are going to change this. We are building something that has never existed. The plural includes everyone in the room, but the direction belongs entirely to the speaker. The revelation belongs to them. The access belongs to them. The audience joins the ritual without ever being asked to define it. And this is where it gets unsettling. The third component is the use of language that cannot be falsified, because it operates in a register where falsification is never expected. Mission, legacy, impact, purpose beyond profit. These words do not describe measurable actions. They describe states of being, and states of being have no failure condition that anyone outside the system can name. When a company declares that its mission is to organize the world's information, that statement cannot be audited, proven, or disproven by anyone. It has no operational definition that an outsider can test. What it has is resonance, and resonance, applied consistently across enough touchpoints and years, produces what social psychologists call identity fusion. You do not just use the product, you become part of the project. The project becomes part of who you are, and who you are is not something you subject to a quarterly earnings review. Drop a comment if this pattern has crossed your mind before when watching a product launch or a company announcement. You might be further along in seeing this than you think. Applied occult knowledge in modern life does not require secrecy. It requires consistency. The same linguistic structures that bound initiates to mystery schools in Alexandria operate today in onboarding documents, brand manifestos, and keynote speeches that get replayed millions of times. The mechanism is identical, only the costume has changed. Why? The most influential business book of the 20th century contained a chapter about summoning the dead. In 1937, Napoleon Hill published a book that has now sold over 100 million copies and still appears on the recommended reading lists of Fortune 500 executives. The book is remembered for its wealth, philosophy. What is almost never discussed is a specific chapter that several popular editions have quietly removed without explanation or acknowledgement of any kind. In that chapter, Hill describes what he calls his invisible counselors, a group of historical figures he consulted mentally before making major decisions. Lincoln, Emerson, Darwin, Napoleon, Edison. He held imaginary council sessions with these figures regularly, reported receiving genuine guidance from them, and credited this practice with some of his most consequential insights and strategic decisions. He described these sessions with complete seriousness, not as visualization exercise, not as metaphor, as a working method he used deliberately and consistently over years. Hill was not a fringe figure operating at the margins of respectable society. He was the systematizer of success philosophy for the American industrial elite at the peak of its expansion, commissioned originally by Andrew Carnegie to codify how power-oriented people actually think and operate when it matters most. What he was describing has a direct structural parallel in shamanic traditions of ancestral consultation practiced across cultures from Siberia to the Andes. It mirrors hermetic ceremonial evocation, where historical or mythological figures are formally invoked as channels for specific qualities of mind. It appears in Tibetan Buddhist visualization practices involving the masters of a lineage, where the practitioner builds detailed internal representations of figures whose qualities they are attempting to embody. In every case, the functional logic is the same. Construct an inner council of symbolic authority that can guide decision-making without requiring external validation or verifiable evidence. Now count how many founders of significant companies speak publicly about historical mentors who shaped their thinking permanently. Figures who died decades before the company existed. Books read so many times the margins are filled with notes from different years. Principles attributed to long-dead philosophers stated as personal operating systems that govern daily decisions. The structure of consulting the symbolic ancestor is not hidden in any of this. It is presented openly, in secular language, and almost no one identifies it as what it is. If this is shifting something in the way you see these leadership narratives, the like, tells the algorithm this kind of investigation matters. It keeps this work alive. Arcane secrets decoded through pattern recognition do not require access to restricted archives. They require looking at what has always been visible and asking a different question about it. The invisible symbolic control over human decisions does not live in shadows. It lives in language so familiar that familiarity itself has become the concealment. What if seeing the pattern does not free you from it? Here is what most analyses of power and language get wrong, and why they fail to be useful to anyone who encounters them. They assume that understanding a mechanism dissolves its effect, that once you see the structure, you are outside it. That knowledge functions as immunity. This is one of the most persistent and consequential misunderstandings in the entire literature on influence and persuasion. It feels true. It is not. A symbol does not require your ignorance to function. It requires your nervous system, because your cognitive architecture was shaped across hundreds of thousands of years to respond to specific patterns of authority, belonging, danger, and salvation before conscious thought has any opportunity to intervene. The response comes first. The reasoning comes after. And the reasoning's job, most of the time, is to justify what already happened below the threshold of awareness. What the priest did, what the CEO does, what the recommendation engine does when it selects the next piece of content for your attention. All of it is targeting the same layer, the layer that exists before language, before choice, before what you would call a decision. Hidden power in modern structures does not require hidden structures. It requires structures so familiar they have become invisible through sheer repetition. The ritual only functions when it is mistaken for something else. Inspiration, vision, leadership, disruption. The moment it is recognized for what it is, something shifts. Not the mechanism, your relationship to it. That shift is not immunity. It is interval. A gap between stimulus and response in which a genuine question becomes possible. What is being activated in me right now? And is that activation something I would choose if I were watching it from outside? Conscious witchcraft as a system of symbolic power describes exactly this interval, across traditions that developed it with rigor over centuries. Not supernatural protection from external influence. The cultivated ability to perceive what is operating below the threshold where ordinary perception begins. Different traditions name it differently. In all of them, developing it produces a measurable and irreversible change in how a person relates to influence of any kind. Subscribe and turn on notifications. What this investigation opened is not a conclusion. It is the beginning of a map. The next video goes into the specific mechanisms that large organizations use to build loyalty that survives direct contradictory evidence, not as a critique, but as a precise account of the symbolic architecture that makes it structurally possible. Because here is what this video did not say, and what you may already be sensing. The pattern you just identified in CEOs and high priests does not stop at the edge of corporate culture. It operates in the stories you construct about your own choices, in the figures you consult when the decision feels too large for one person, in the voice you use when you explain your own life to yourself. That is the layer this investigation barely touched, and that is exactly where the next one begins.